bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State. Life, liberty, and your pursuit of happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
And once again, welcome to Society and the State. I'm Brian Hyde along with Connor Boyack. We're going to talk about property rights today. And this is kind of an interesting topic to bring up because we say a lot about property rights, and I know people, they love to stand for their property rights. This is my property. But the question remains, do property rights really exist? And I think, the initial answer I'd have to say is, well, yes, in part, but we have to qualify it because there have been a lot of forces chipping away at what I would consider authentic property rights, meaning you actually have control, ownership, and you have sovereignty over your personal property. Doesn't seem like there's very many areas of our lives where we can say that regarding any kind of real property these days.
Yeah, I think that's true, especially if you look at the U.S. Constitution and how it treats property, right? You can't be deprived of property without due process, so this leads to a concept we'll dabble in today called eminent domain, where as long as you're being given due process, the government can deprive you of property. So it's not an absolute right. It's not saying you can tell the government to pound sand that you're not going to build a park here, or in the case of the famous Kelo Supreme Court case from a decade ago, the Little Pink House, where Pfizer wanted to build there, and so the government razed the Little Pink House to the ground, and to this day the land is vacant because Pfizer ended up saying, no, we're going to build elsewhere. And yet the Supreme Court decided in a split decision that the government is allowed to take people's property for quote-unquote economic development, not for roads, not for a utility plant that has to be located there. No, we just want to improve the tax base in this area, so we're going to allow you to seize this property, raise the family's building that's home that's been in their family for years to the ground, and improve and increase the tax base. So what I want to focus on momentarily, Brian, before we continue, because I know we want to get in especially to something like civil asset forfeiture, which is quite infuriating to a lot of people on this issue. But I mentioned the Constitution, and for those who are kind of the Federalists in the room, you might plausibly believe that property ownership, land use, is a local issue and therefore was not intended to be in the U.S. Constitution, right? And therefore it's a matter left up to the states, and I would agree with that. However, when you look at all the state constitutions, which we did a couple of years ago, you find that only about half really protect property rights beyond kind of this eminent domain issue. Half of the states have this clause. It seems like a lot of the state conventions kind of copied and pasted, although copying and pasting didn't really exist back then, but they kind of borrowed these clauses from other state constitutions as they kind of figure out what they wanted to do. And so there's this one phrase that talks about that you have the right to acquire and possess property, right? And so you have the ability to acquire it, to purchase something. Sure, you have that right. You have the ability to own it. You can have title to it.
That's your name on the title.
Right, exactly. And then also defend, right? And so you have the ability to defend. If someone wants to try and come, bomb your house, you can, fight back. However, what no state has, with the exception of one, and it's a very weak exception that in fact doesn't really exist, what really no state has in their constitution is a protection for the right to actually use your property. So you can get it, you can put your name on the title, you can defend it if someone hostile comes against it, but you don't have the right to actually use it. And what this translates to is that city governments, therefore, developing their land use, their zoning laws, can easily override any individual's desire or, quote, right to use their property. Sorry, you can't do Airbnb on your home. We don't allow it. Sorry, you can't build that shed. Sorry, you can't have trees of that type. You can't have a fence like that. And they can micromanage legally, constitutionally, how you use the property you own, right? You can own it. It's yours, but only if you use it, in the way that we say, because there is no constitutional protection for the right to actually use your property. So what is the point of acquiring and owning property that you don't actually have the right to determine how you're going to use it? It's a big problem arising from zoning in the past century with the rise of the progressive era.
It reminds me of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, in which they go through something that sounds very much like our own Bill of Rights, except every aspect of it, from that freedom of speech and freedom of whatever, is qualified by the phrase except as prescribed by law, or as it pertains to by law. So there's the out, there's the loophole, and I think the same thing applies to property. Oh yeah, you're free to use your property according to the law.
Yep.
Which bureaucrats will endlessly be manipulating and changing and taking advantage of.
And there's one state I mentioned that does have the word use in its enumeration of rights pertaining to property, then has a clause after that says it's all subject to statute that the legislature passes. So we're gonna put in the Constitution you have this right, but the legislature can do anything they want about it. And of course the legislature has, right? And so the right doesn't actually exist. And so that's a big problem for me as I look at zoning, right? What this boils down to for me, Brian, and I know you've had experiences with this, especially being in southern Utah and observing what one particular city has done there, is the fact that your neighbors have more right to control the use of your property than you do. Okay? If I say that I want to put a race car track, little mini RC race car track in my backyard, I have some decent-sized property in this fictitious example, and I want to put this little, race car track for my kids and their friends to play on. The city can say, well, that's not a permitted use of the property, therefore you're not allowed to do it. And it can be a contested issue and a big debate in the city and hearings at the city council meeting with my request for a variance or, changing the zoning or whatever. And at the end of the day, my neighbors, through this voting process of, supposed delegated authority to these supposed representatives, my neighbors have the ability to control what I do. They can, through as we've said in a past episode, the majority of the minority, they can go vote. They can elect city councilmen, elected officials, and they can dictate what I'm allowed to do on my own property. They have more right to control my property than I do. And that is a very sad realization for those who want to use their property in a way that perhaps their neighbors may not want them to. And yet out of this desire for, my property value may decrease, therefore, right? You don't have a right to I have many things to say here. When you get into the economics of it, all value is subjective, right?
Yep.
There is no absolute value. And so this subjective property value becomes the basis for many people to control their neighbors because they want to keep their property values high, even though there is no absolute inherent, property value. And Brian, you know as well as I that time and time again, voters or individuals, property owners, are very willing to use the political process to control what their neighbors are doing. We've seen many examples of it, right?
I have a tendency when someone starts in on I've got to keep my property values up, I'll ask them, are you selling your property right now? Well, no. Then why is this a concern? I mean, you don't know what the market's going to do. You don't know if we're going to see another 2008, 2009. Maybe your home's value is going to dip by 50%.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it so essential that you control your neighbor over that perception that it's affecting your property value when you don't even have control over that?
That's a great point. And part of the problem stems, too, from incorporation and living in cities that are actually, as the word incorporation suggests, they're actually corporations. And
plus the social contract.
And
you chose to live here, so
absolutely.
That's your name right there on the social contract.
Oh boy, a topic for another day. So we've already covered that topic, so we'll just link to it, so we don't have to talk about that monstrosity again, that horrible fiction. But this is very real, right? You encounter people all the time who want to do things that perhaps their neighbors don't want. Setting up a lemonade stand for little kids, right? Yep. Oh, sorry, you're not allowed to do that. It's so depressing for those who actually want to use their property in a peaceful way as they see fit. They're not bugging their neighbors. They're not, causing any harm or nuisance or anything like that. And at the end of the day, your neighbors have more control over your use of your property than you do. It is a very unsettling thing for a person who champions property rights per se, quote unquote, to come to the realization that they don't really exist when they're subject to the whims of your neighbors.
I think it comes back to something that we had talked about in a previous episode, and that is, what did we call it? Rational ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
People, we think, we have these laws. I have a title here that has my name on it. Therefore, my property is secure. But they don't really know. And because they don't know, suddenly they find themselves surprised when, a code enforcement officer or a person from the zoning department comes by and writes them up and asserts control over their property and asserts, a demand for money because, you you built your fence, but you didn't apply for this proper permit and permission from us before you used your property. They've harmed no one, but because they didn't jump through the bureaucratic hoops and they didn't know that they needed to do it, now they're they're on the wrong side of an equation there.
And as we did talk about in episode 89, this concept of rational ignorance, you also have the Supreme Court precedent that ignorance of the law is no excuse. This applies especially to criminal law, right? Where if you violate a crime, or let's say you stain your fence the wrong color, or whatever, right? The legal doctrine now in America is that you are held accountable to every statute that every elected official passes merely by fact that it exists and went through the process, whether or not you know about it, right? And so people are rationally ignorant, as we've talked about. It makes sense why people aren't aware, don't read statutes and ordinances. They're not familiar with processes and policies and politicians. And yet at the end of the day, they do something on their property the way that they want that doesn't harm anybody else. And if there's a law that says that they can't do that, they are held accountable to that, whether or not they even knew about it. And so you talk to people who chafe against this, as I have, as we work on a lot of these policies here at Libertas Institute. And it's depressing to these people because the scales fall off, right? They kind of grew up thinking, oh, well, we have property rights, right? Until they have this experience where they try and do something that deviates a little from the norm, and they find that they don't, and they can't.
I'll give you an example of one of the most distressing things I saw. It wasn't even so much how the bureaucracy operated, but the willingness of people to defend the bureaucracy as if, well, we have to do this, otherwise everybody's going to be rendering, horse carcasses, in some kind of meat packing plant there in their yard just because they can. Mm-hmm. It's always the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. I think the example I want to refer to is a guy was having Bible study meetings at his home, and he'd have 20 or 30 people show up, and the state went after him. You don't have a license for that. Your home is not zoned for a church, or it's not zoned for meetings.
What?
And I was like, okay, they're not parking on the neighbors' lawns. They're not parking in the neighbors' driveways. He had property where people could park. Mm-hmm. And then the complaint was, and this is people defending the bureaucracy, well, but that's a lot of cars driving up and down the street.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm like, well, for heaven's sakes, let's, heaven forbid there's a fireworks show at the nearby school, because you'd have a lot of cars driving up and down the street. What are we going to do? Mm-hmm. But the disturbing part is how quickly people would defend bureaucracy.
Oh, yeah.
Without any concept of what about the guy's property rights?
And people want their own property rights, but they also want to control their neighbors.
Sure.
So the neighbors in that case may very well have supported the action because they don't want it happening. At the end of the day, though, if they ever had like a little, essential oil party or Tupperware party or family reunion or whatever, they clearly would have wanted the ability to have gatherings of large numbers of people and not have the same turned on them.
Okay, what I'm going to say is going to sound kind of mean, but I mean this in the kindest possible sense. Everybody needs to find themselves bent over a barrel by government at one point or another, just so they can empathize with what it's like to be on the receiving end of, the administrations of the state.
Yeah.
I think that we'd be a lot less inclined to want to exercise that control over our neighbor if we truly understood what it was to be in that person's shoes.
And yet there's also an opportunity, Brian. I don't disagree with you. However, I think through education we can make sure that people are aware of other people being bent over the barrel and share that story in a way so that it emotionally resonates with the person as if it happened to them. When you do storytelling, right, you kind of take over the person's brain in a way that you, as you know from being in a movie theater, you kind of participate in the story. You feel as if you're in that person's shoes. And so I think that we have these opportunities. So let's now talk about civil asset forfeiture, a great example where very, very, very few people have had this happen to them, where the government literally steals their property. And yet when you look at the way people react when they learn about this, or if they already know about this, how they feel, you look at the polling, which is in like the 80th percentile of people who oppose civil asset forfeiture, it's amazing, right? Because these people, by and large, have never been the subject of civil asset forfeiture, and yet they're very passionate about it, myself included. I've never had this happen to me, right? And yet I feel extremely passionate about changing these laws that allow the government to take property from innocent people. And so I know that there's many stories about this. In fact, you wanted to share one.
Yeah, I just came across this story last week, and every one of these asset forfeiture stories is egregious to me. This one was especially egregious. We're talking about a 64-year-old immigrant by the name of Rustem Kazai. He came to America from Albania, and he had his life savings, $58,100, seized by U.S. Customs and Border Protection Service because he was traveling by air back to Albania for the purpose of buying a retirement home on the Adriatic coast. And he was traveling, and my friend Eric Peters, in writing about this, says he was stupidly, although not illegally, traveling with this large amount of cash because he didn't understand. And there's a language barrier here. His English is not good.
Culture barrier.
But they found money in his possession, $58,100 to be exact, and took it from him without so much as an alleged violation, not even a traffic violation. It was just the fact he had the money. And what was interesting was when the border and customs folks took the money, it was weeks before they actually issued a receipt, which never stated the amount of money taken.
Wow.
And when he finally pressed them and said, look, I want to know what happened to my money. Okay, well, yeah, we took this much currency, and they gave him some odd amount, which it could not have been because all of his money was in $100 bills. And it came out to, it was missing like $776 or something like that. So it was some odd amount.
Yeah.
But the idea was they took it from him without any charges being filed. He's never been convicted of anything. Airport security found the money in his carry-on bag, neatly packed. He wasn't trying to hide. It wasn't sewn into the lining of a briefcase or anything like that.
Right.
But because he could not give them what they considered this satisfactory explanation for where did you get it and how can you show us that you legally obtained it, it's gone.
Yeah.
And the language barrier, of course, didn't help as he was trying to explain. They went after him for money structuring.
What does that even mean?
Money structuring is when anytime you take $10,000 or put $10,000 into the bank has to file a financial disclosure form with the IRS telling, hey,
suspicious activity report.
Connor had, $10,000 going in or out. So if you're doing it in amounts smaller than $10,000, especially if you have multiple accounts, say $900 or $9,500, they call that structuring because it's presumed, and that's a felony, by the way, that you're trying to avoid
the suspicious activity report. Wow.
And here, this guy over time had put away, this money, and then he'd gone and taken out the money from the bank, and they wouldn't let him take it all out at once, but they were going to go after him for, structuring in addition to taking his money. I'm insult to injury. Oh, that's a nasty looking cut. Here, can I rub some salt in there for you?
And when you have these immigrants who come to supposed land of the free, coming to America, escaping some of these regimes and oppressive countries that they lived in. The presumption is very much that, this type of thing would not happen. I mean, this is basically like gangster activity. Hey, we're going to take this. We think, these are ill-gotten gains. And inevitably, that's how civil asset forfeiture usually is. They assert, law enforcement, that the cash you have on hand was the proceeds of a drug transaction. They may have zero evidence of any kind. And yet the mere assertion, the mere belief that, no, people don't carry cash anymore. So clearly this is, the proceeds of a drug sale. I'm going to take this money. They don't have to have any evidence. And, different states have passed different laws on this issue trying to crack down. Federally, the legal standard is much lower. In other words, it's easier for a prosecutor to successfully and finally take permanent possession of the property. And we're talking cars, computers, homes, not just cash.
Jewelry.
Yeah, even though it's very heavily cash. And so the ability of government to do this is being restrained at some levels of government, but at the federal government, it's much easier. And that's where you see this abuse start to take place. And that's where you see more money is taken through civil asset forfeiture by the government nationally than is stolen through burglary. That's astounding.
Yeah. Well, and it's an out for those states that have stepped in and decided to limit those instances in which the state law enforcement can take money from people. What they'll do is they will partner with federal agencies, and those federal agencies, we just turned it over to the DEA, and the DEA took it from there. See, it's out of our hands. We didn't take it. The DEA took it.
We're involved in a case on that very issue here in Utah. We filed an amicus brief before our state's Supreme Court because there was this incident, much like this immigrant, Brian, where you say nothing illegal but kind of stupid to, perhaps carry that much cash and travel with it. This gentleman had a Bitcoin buying and selling business, and so he transacted in large amounts of cash. This was, I think, when Bitcoin was kind of at its apex, roughly half a year ago or so, and so he was pulled over for following a car too closely in front of him, And the officer asked to search his vehicle, and he said no. And so they called out the canine unit.
Oh, you mean the warrant generator?
Exactly. And, anyone who carries a large amount of cash is going to have a positive alert from a canine for having drugs, because all money, all cash, is basically tainted with drugs. There have been scientific studies analyzing dollar bills, and there's trace elements of drugs on basically all cash that you carry. So when you have huge bundles of it, right, of course that's going to trigger a smell. And so the canine alerted on the vehicle. They didn't find any contraband. They didn't find any guns, any drugs, anything else. They just found a whole bunch of cash. I mean, like a few $100,000 of cash. This guy, kind of stupid to travel with that much cash. But when the banks don't really like Bitcoin and all this kind of stuff, you can see why someone might be transacting in cash. Again, nothing illegal. And so the state took the money. And as you were just pointing out with kind of the DEA and everything, the federal government swooped in and said, well, we're interested in this case, give us the money. So the state agency writes a check. Well, the whole reason why we're in court over this is that we've gotten laws passed here in our state that says you can't give a forfeiture case to the federal government, where it's easier, where there's stronger incentive to, do the forfeitures because the government can succeed more easily. You can't do that unless you go to a state court judge, you explain why it's necessary, and you get approval. Only then can you give it to, the federal government. That's not at all what happened here. And so state law enforcement effectively violated state law, and that's why we're kind of tangling with them on that issue. And yet time and time again, you see these stories where there is a strong incentive to take these forfeitures to the federal government, where not only is the legal standard lower, so it's legally easier for them to take possession of this property, but they have this program called equitable sharing, where 80% of the revenue goes straight to the law enforcement agency. So you talk about incentives. There's a very strong incentive for law enforcement agencies to be involved, especially those who have tight budgets or whatever, because if you can get the feds involved and forfeit this guy's property and come away with tens of thousands of dollars or more, hey, that's you can go buy some toys and you can buy some new, body cameras, or you can buy whatever. That incentive is very strong. And that's why historically law enforcement has been deeply involved and invested in this issue, because of the financial incentives by which their agencies can profit from something like civil asset forfeiture. But at the end of the day, you take a case like this kid who was wanting to start a food truck business. He goes to the bank to take money out of ATM. He's literally on his way to go buy this used food truck. He's pulled over, the money's taken, and now his whole business aspiration is shut down. And if you have $1,500, let's say, taken through civil asset forfeiture, if your money is confiscated, are you going to contest that if hiring an attorney costs, let's say, $5,000? No, obviously not. And so you never end up fighting these issues at these lower amounts, where people are consistently screwed by their own government, because now suddenly they would have to not only lose that money, but lose even more money hiring an attorney to recover that money. It just doesn't make any sense. And so then you have this threshold in which the government can just take and take and take, and very rarely will anyone contest it because the economics just don't work out. And so to take civil asset forfeiture back to our question, Brian, it seems like the answer is simply no, that property rights don't actually exist when our own government can do these types of things.
I don't know if you remember or if you've ever seen the 1972 movie Deliverance.
No.
It's kind of a cult classic. Burt Reynolds was in it, Ned Beatty, and a bunch of other big names. But the gist of it was a shocking movie for its time. It was a group of friends floating in canoes down a lazy river in backwoods Georgia or Florida or someplace. It's where you get the whole dueling banjos, the sense of we're in hillbilly country. And one of the traumatic scenes of that movie is these guys are accosted by a couple of crazed hillbillies at gunpoint, who rob them and rape them. I mean, it's a horrific scene, but there's a line that one of those hillbillies says, because as these guys are being held at gunpoint, they're like, look, take our money. And the hillbilly tells him, shut up. If we want your money, we'll take your money. I only bring this up because that's really kind of the attitude behind the civil asset forfeiture. It's like, if we want it, we'll take it.
Yep. And the law,
right and wrong are not a consideration.
Totally. Nor is any criminal wrongdoing in many cases. You don't have to be convicted of a crime. And if in America we are in fact presumed innocent until proven guilty, it would stand to reason that the same should apply to your property. That, okay, we're not going to criminally charge you, but we believe that, this $2,000 you have in cash was involved in a crime. So we don't have to prove that you did any crime, but on this mere belief, we're just going to go ahead and take your property. For all we talk about property rights, Brian, it seems like at the end of the day, when you analyze it, it's very troubling to see the degree to which we don't actually have these rights. If you have these rights, something like the Second Amendment, right? That's been pretty well fleshed out. People very strongly defend that. There's a lot of good laws protecting and establishing the individual right to keep and bear arms, even though it's restricted by many states. But by and large, that is a right that is very well understood, well regarded, well protected. I don't think the same thing applies to property rights. I think, especially when you look at, as I said, the state constitutions not actually protecting the right to use property. They'll protect everything else. You can buy it, you can own it, you can defend it. You can't actually use it. And I think at the end of the day, that's purposeful. I think people, by and large, are okay with their property rights being diminished if it gives them the ability to control everybody else's property on the same token. So I don't think, as sad as it is to say, as big a champion of freedom as you and I are, I don't think we actually really truly have property rights in America.
Sadly, I would have to agree. So what do we do to change it?
Crickets. Just kidding.
No, I know that it's something you're working on. I know in the case of the immigrant that I talked about who had his $58,100 seized, the Institute for Justice has stepped in and has filed a lawsuit in his behalf. But something's got to change at the policy level to put government back on its leash.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of civil asset forfeiture, we benefit from the fact that so many people are enraged by it, that the policies are shifting. As I said, a lot of states are changing their laws, adding greater property protection rights, making it harder for the government. So I think with time and with more stories like this and lawsuits, it's only going to improve. Just as the Little Pink House, the Kelo case that I mentioned, where Pfizer wanted the property and the government, the Supreme Court said that the lady's house could be taken for that use. That Kelo case enraged so many people that almost every single state passed a resolution or a statute pushing back. And so the more that we can educate people, the more that we can get these stories out, whether through lawsuits or through storytelling and videos, I think is only going to help. I think the hardest battle is going to be zoning. We have over a century now of this concept of zoning where we're going to control people's property. And I'll tell you, as we've circulated this idea of amending our state constitution here in Utah to actually protect the right to use your property, cities, to them, this is like World War III, because their power, at the end of the day, all of the power that local governments have rest on this concept of land use. Other than that, they provide garbage, and and water or whatever. This is their power. This is where they can flex their muscle. And man, I am struggling to identify the ways in which we can succeed on this issue when you are battling dozens, hundreds of these funded, with lobbying effort, these cities who are going to fight back. But that's where the battle needs to be. And I think at the end of the day, like this immigrant story, Brian, that you shared, or the Little Pink House, or these other stories, we have to find stories of injustice. We have to identify what's happening wrong so we can persuade other people to our cause. But you're also having to argue against people's direct incentive to want to control their neighbors. They may conceptually agree and say, well, yeah, I think what happened to that person is wrong, but I still want the ability to make sure that my neighbors don't do anything to affect my property value. So the incentive is for something like land use ordinances and zoning to exist. That's going to be a big battle, and one that we're trying to still noodle around and figure out how we can address. But at the end of the day, it's these stories that I think are going to illuminate and educate people about the issue, and then hopefully motivate, as you say, some change so that we can actually start pushing back.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Again, this is societyinthestate.com/91. We encourage you, subscribe, share it with your friends, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.